May 14, 1944. Naples, Italy, 0500 hours. American Lieutenant Sarah Martinez of the 15th Medical Battalion stood in the doorway of a makeshift hospital, watching the sunrise over the Bay of Naples. The daughter of a Spanish immigrant doctor who had served in the American Red Cross during the Spanish flu pandemic, Martinez had joined the Army Medical Corps in 1942. Now, as dawn broke over war-torn Italy, she would witness something that contradicted every assumption about the relationship between medicine and war. What she saw in the next 8 weeks would shake the foundations of military medicine for generations to come. The American forces were supposed to be focused solely on fighting. On paper, they were. The Army's medical resources had been stretched thin across 2 theatres of war. Sicily alone had overwhelmed field hospitals with thousands of wounded soldiers. The Mediterranean theatre required 72,000 beds for military casualties, while civilian medical care was considered a secondary concern at best. The U.S. Fifth Army had arrived with medical units primarily designated for treating American troops. Yet within 60 days, American medics would save thousands of Italian children who were dying from infections that had been untreatable just months earlier. The mathematical impossibility had occurred. A wartime medical corps had somehow expanded its mission to bring a revolutionary medicine to a civilian population in the midst of one of history's deadliest conflicts. This is not a story about heroic battlefield surgery. This is not a story about military evacuation tactics. This is the story of how a group of American military doctors and nurses revolutionized pediatric medicine in war-torn Italy through training, innovation, and a medical philosophy so radically different from conventional military practice that it created healing that should have been impossible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The transformation began not on the battlefields of World War II, but in the laboratories of Oxford University years before. September 3rd, 1928. Alexander Fleming had returned from a family vacation to his laboratory at St Mary's Hospital in London. While sorting through Petri dishes containing colonies of Staphylococcus bacteria, he noticed something unusual. A mold had developed on one dish, and the bacteria around it had been destroyed. Fleming's accidental discovery of penicillin would take years to develop into a usable medicine. The task of turning this laboratory curiosity into a life-saving drug fell to a team of researchers at Oxford University, led by Howard Florey and Ernst Chain. In 1940, they demonstrated penicillin's effectiveness against bacterial infections in mice. By 1941, they had produced enough to treat their first human patient, a policeman suffering from a life-threatening infection. The results were miraculous, but production remained painfully limited. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, American pharmaceutical companies began mass-producing penicillin. By early 1944, production had increased from a few liters a month to 100 billion units per month. This unprecedented industrial achievement would transform the treatment of wounded soldiers and, unexpectedly, create an opportunity to save thousands of civilian lives in war-ravaged Europe. Colonel Walter Richards, appointed to lead the 15th Medical Battalion in 1943, made a decision that would reshape medical history. If American forces could only spare limited medical resources for civilian care, those resources would be deployed with maximum impact. Richards's vision was revolutionary. He chose to create a specialized medical task force, a team of doctors and nurses trained not just to treat battle casualties, but to bring the newest medical miracle, penicillin, to a population devastated by years of war and deprivation, the children of southern Italy. This was not mere idealism. This was systematic preparation for a humanitarian crisis that military planners could see developing as Allied forces pushed northward through the Italian peninsula. Every medic assigned to the pediatric initiative would be trained not just for emergency care, but for the treatment of diseases that had been death sentences just months before: bacterial pneumonia, infected wounds, sepsis, meningitis. This philosophy had deep roots stretching back through American medical history. The American military medical tradition emphasized something called expanding the scope of care, the concept that military medicine could and should extend beyond treating just combat casualties when circumstances allowed. The concept was revolutionary in its simplicity and radical in its implications. Military medical units would be given primary mission objectives of caring for troops, but when possible, would extend that care to civilian populations in dire need. This stood in stark contrast to the medical philosophies of most armies, where military doctors were restricted to treating only their own forces. Expanding the scope of care required flexibility. It required medical officers who could think independently. It required doctors and nurses at every level who understood not just their immediate mission, but the broader humanitarian implications of their work. The American medical training system was designed to create exactly these practitioners. Captain James Williams, who led the pediatric penicillin initiative, embodied this approach. A pediatrician from Boston who had joined the Army Medical Corps in 1942, Williams understood that the suffering of Italian children presented both a humanitarian crisis and an opportunity to demonstrate the value of American medicine as a force for good. "We're not just winning territory," he told his team during their first briefing in Naples. "We're winning hearts and minds through medicine." The program began modestly in February 1944, treating a few dozen children with life-threatening infections in a converted school building near Naples Harbor. Within weeks, as word spread through the devastated communities of southern Italy, hundreds of desperate parents were bringing their children to American medical stations. The scenes were heartbreaking: mothers carrying feverish infants, fathers with children weakened by infection, grandparents bringing toddlers with infected wounds that wouldn't heal. The American medical teams were not prepared for the volume, but they adapted quickly. Lieutenant Martinez, who had trained as a nurse in San Francisco's busiest emergency room, established a triage system that identified the most critical cases for immediate penicillin treatment. Interpreters were recruited from the local population. Training programs were established to teach Italian medical personnel how to administer the new wonder drug. The results were immediate and dramatic. Children who would have died from bacterial pneumonia were recovering within days. Infants with infected wounds were healing instead of developing sepsis. Toddlers with meningitis were surviving an illness that had been nearly 100% fatal. Maria Conti, a young mother from a fishing village near Salerno, later described bringing her 4-year-old son Luca to an American medical station in March 1944. The boy had developed pneumonia following a case of measles, a common and often fatal complication in that era. "He couldn't breathe," she recalled in an interview decades later. "His lips were blue. The doctor in our village said to prepare ourselves that he would not survive the night." At the American Field Hospital, Lieutenant David Cohen, a medical officer from Philadelphia, examined the boy and immediately recognized a case where penicillin could make the difference between life and death. Within hours of receiving his first injection, Luca's fever began to subside. By the next morning, his breathing had improved. After 3 days of treatment, he was sitting up, asking for food. After 5 days, he was playing with other recovering children in the hospital courtyard. "It was like witnessing a resurrection," Maria Conti said. The American doctors had performed a miracle. The story repeated itself hundreds, then thousands of times across southern Italy in the spring and summer of 1944. As Allied forces pushed northward, fighting their way up the Italian peninsula, American medical units followed, bringing penicillin and other medical innovations to a civilian population that had suffered through years of war, malnutrition, and inadequate medical care. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The penicillin program faced significant challenges. Military priorities meant that supplies were limited and could be diverted at any time if combat casualties increased. Language barriers complicated treatment. Cultural differences led to misunderstandings. Some Italian parents, suspicious of foreign medicine, refused treatment until they saw other children recovering from seemingly hopeless conditions. But the American medical teams adapted with remarkable creativity. They trained local interpreters not just to translate words, but to explain medical concepts in culturally appropriate ways. They developed picture cards showing the treatment process for parents who couldn't read. They worked with local priests and community leaders to build trust in communities where foreigners, even those bringing life-saving medicine, were viewed with suspicion. The program expanded as more penicillin became available. What had started as a limited humanitarian gesture evolved into a systematic effort to bring the new antibiotic to as many Italian children as possible. By June 1944, American medical units had established pediatric treatment centers in 24 towns and villages across southern Italy. The impact went far beyond the individual lives saved. Italian doctors and nurses, working alongside American medical personnel, learned how to administer penicillin and incorporate it into treatment protocols. Techniques for maintaining sterile conditions in makeshift facilities were shared. Diagnostic approaches were taught and practiced. The seeds were being planted for a transformation of Italian pediatric medicine that would continue long after American forces moved on. Captain Williams implemented something that would later be called the multiplier approach. Rather than treating as many children as American medical personnel could handle directly, he established training programs for Italian healthcare workers. Each American nurse or doctor would train 5 to 10 Italian counterparts, who would then be equipped to continue treatment after the Americans departed. This was not theoretical training conducted in formal classrooms. This was intensive, practical preparation that assumed every Italian healthcare worker might suddenly find themselves solely responsible for treating dozens of desperately ill children. Lieutenant Martinez, who spoke fluent Italian thanks to her Spanish language background, led many of these training sessions. "We're not just saving lives today," she told a group of Italian nurses in April 1944. "We're giving you the knowledge and skills to save many more tomorrow." The philosophy extended to something called adaptive medicine, the recognition that textbook approaches often had to be modified in resource-limited settings. American medical personnel had been trained to adapt standard procedures to battlefield conditions. Now they applied this same flexibility to civilian pediatric care in settings where electricity was unreliable, clean water was scarce, and medical equipment was limited to whatever could be carried in a field kit. This was dangerous, challenging work. American medical personnel worked exhausting shifts, often treating military casualties by day and civilian children by night. They faced the constant risk of enemy action, as German forces regularly targeted areas behind Allied lines. Supplies were often delayed or diverted to more urgent military needs, but the advantage in terms of lives saved was overwhelming. While traditional military medical doctrine emphasized focusing exclusively on military casualties, the American approach of extending care to civilians, particularly children, created benefits that went far beyond humanitarian concerns. Italian families whose children were saved became invaluable allies, providing intelligence about German positions, warning of ambushes, and sometimes hiding wounded American soldiers in their homes at great personal risk. By midsummer 1944, the program had expanded northward as the Allied advance continued. When American forces entered Rome on the 4th of June 1944, medical units followed closely behind, immediately establishing treatment centers in the city's poorest neighborhoods, where years of war and deprivation had left children particularly vulnerable to infectious disease. Sofia Lombardi, a nurse at Rome's Bambino Gesù Children's Hospital, later described the arrival of American medical teams as a second liberation. The hospital had been overwhelmed with sick children and had no access to the new antibiotic that American medicine had made possible. When Captain Williams arrived with the first supplies of penicillin, the hospital staff initially didn't believe his claims about the drug's effectiveness. "We had seen too many children die from infections to believe that a medicine could save them so quickly," Lombardi recalled. "But then we saw it with our own eyes. Children who would have certainly died were recovering in days. It seemed impossible." The skepticism quickly turned collaboration. American medical personnel worked alongside Italian doctors and nurses, sharing knowledge, techniques, and the precious antibiotic. Within weeks, Italian medical staff were administering penicillin themselves, carefully following the protocols that American teams had established. What happened next demonstrated the full power of American medical training and philosophy applied at operational scale. While the original program had focused on treating acute infections, pneumonia, wound infections, meningitis, the teams began to address broader public health issues that threatened Italian children. Under Lieutenant Martinez's direction, teams began providing basic preventive care in addition to penicillin treatment. They established vaccination programs for diseases like diphtheria and tetanus. They created nutrition centers that provided supplements to combat the malnutrition that made children more vulnerable to infection. They implemented basic sanitation measures in refugee camps and crowded urban neighborhoods. The scale of the operation grew beyond anything its founders had imagined. By August 1944, American medical teams and their Italian counterparts had treated more than 10,000 children with penicillin. The mortality rate for bacterial pneumonia, previously around 30%, dropped to less than 3% among treated children. Meningitis, which had been nearly always fatal, saw survival rates climb to over 70%. Infected wounds, which frequently led to amputation or death, were healing cleanly after penicillin treatment. The impact on Italian communities was profound. In village after village, town after town, American medical personnel were greeted not as occupiers but as saviors. Children who had been at death's door just days earlier were playing in streets and piazzas. Parents who had prepared to bury their children were instead watching them recover with astonishing speed. Father Paolo Bianchi, a parish priest in a small village near Anzio, wrote, in his diary in April 1944, "Today I prepared to give last rites to little Alessandra Ricci, who has been fevered and delirious for 3 days with an infection. Her parents took her to the American doctors this morning as a final, desperate measure. This evening, I visited expecting to find mourning, but instead discovered the child sitting up, her fever gone, talking and asking for soup. The mother wept as she told me about the American medicine. If this is not a miracle from God, it is the closest thing I have witnessed." The story of American penicillin in Italy spread rapidly through word of mouth, creating what military planners called a halo effect that helped ease tensions between occupying forces and the local population. Children who had been treated would run alongside American military vehicles, waving and cheering. Parents would bring food, wine, and small gifts to medical stations. In some villages, American medical personnel were literally embraced as they walked through the streets. This was not an accident or American luck. This was the result of careful planning that had recognized the potential of penicillin not just as a life-saving drug, but as a demonstration of American values in action. General Mark Clark, commanding the Fifth Army, had supported the pediatric initiative not just for humanitarian reasons, but because he understood its strategic implications. "Every child we save," he told his staff, "creates a family that will remember American kindness for generations. This is how we win the peace that will follow this war." The pediatric penicillin program was not without controversy within military circles. Some officers argued that any diversion of medical resources from treating American casualties was inappropriate. Others questioned whether creating dependency on American medicine might cause problems when those resources eventually withdrew. But the results were difficult to argue with, not just in terms of lives saved, but in terms of goodwill generated in a population that would be critical to post-war reconstruction. In a war marked by destruction, the pediatric penicillin initiative stood out as an act of creation, building bridges between cultures, establishing medical practices that would continue long after American forces departed, demonstrating that even in the midst of history's most destructive conflict, healing was possible. As summer turned to fall in 1944, American forces continued their difficult advance up the Italian peninsula. The pediatric penicillin program moved with them, establishing new treatment centers as territories were liberated from German occupation. With each new town or village, the pattern repeated: initial skepticism, followed by astonishment at penicillin's effectiveness, followed by collaboration between American and Italian medical personnel. The scope of the American pediatric penicillin program in Italy expanded in ways that its originators could never have imagined. By September 1944, a decision was made that would further amplify its impact. Rather than limiting treatment to emergency cases in established medical centers, Captain Williams implemented mobile penicillin clinics, military ambulances converted into treatment facilities that could reach remote villages where children were dying without access to care. These mobile units, each staffed by one doctor and two nurses, ventured into areas that had seen no formal medical care for years. They navigated mountain roads damaged by war, crossed rivers on makeshift bridges, and sometimes traveled on foot when vehicles could go no further. The teams carried portable refrigeration units to keep the penicillin stable, technology developed specifically for battlefield medicine that now served a humanitarian purpose. Lieutenant Rachel Goldstein, who led one of the first mobile units into the Apennine Mountains, described the conditions they encountered. These villages were completely isolated. Some had been caught in the crossfire between retreating German forces and advancing Allies. Others had been deliberately damaged as part of the German scorched earth policy. The children were suffering not just from infections, but from malnutrition, exposure, and trauma. When we arrived with medicine that could save their lives, it seemed miraculous to them, and sometimes to us as well. The mobile clinics faced extraordinary challenges. German snipers sometimes targeted medical personnel, forcing teams to travel at night. Mines and unexploded ordnance made some roads impassable. Winter weather in the mountains created conditions where vehicles couldn't operate at all. But the teams persisted, sometimes carrying penicillin and other supplies on mules or on their own backs to reach children in the most remote locations. Anna Rossi, a mother from a small village near Bologna, later recalled the arrival of an American medical team in October 1944. My daughter Teresa had been sick for days with a terrible fever. Her breathing was so difficult, and she coughed blood. We had tried everything, old remedies, prayers. The priest had already visited to prepare us. Then someone from the next village came running to tell us Americans were coming with medicine that could save children. I carried Teresa 3 kilometers to meet them on the road. The doctor, a woman named Goldstein, gave Teresa an injection right there. By evening, her fever had broken. By the next day, she could breathe again. 2 days later, she was asking for food. The Americans saved her life, but they also gave me back my faith that God had not abandoned us. These scenes repeated in hundreds of villages across northern Italy as the mobile penicillin units followed the Allied advance. The impact went far beyond individual lives saved. In communities traumatized by years of war, the arrival of medical help, specifically for children, represented something profound, the return of humanity, and hope to places where both had been in desperately short supply. The program's success led to its expansion in ways that military planners had not anticipated. By late 1944, the U.S. War Department authorized a significant increase in penicillin allocation for civilian use in liberated territories. What had begun as a small humanitarian initiative by a single medical battalion had become an official part of American strategy in occupied territories, medicine as a form of diplomacy, healing as a way to win trust. The transformation was not merely administrative. The expanded program required new training protocols, supply chains, and coordination systems. Captain Williams and his team developed streamlined methods for teaching penicillin administration to Italian healthcare workers, creating what they called rapid capability transfer, the ability to quickly train local medical personnel to continue treatment after American forces moved on. The philosophy behind this approach was revolutionary for military medicine. Rather than creating dependency on American medical support, the goal was to establish self-sustaining local capacity as quickly as possible. This stood in stark contrast to traditional occupation medicine, which typically maintained strict control over advanced treatments and technologies. Lieutenant Martinez, who had been promoted to captain by this time, led the training program for Italian nurses and doctors. "We're not just bringing a medicine," she told her American staff. We're bringing knowledge that will outlast our presence here. Every Italian healthcare worker we train becomes a multiplier who can save hundreds of lives long after we've gone. This approach created a legacy that would extend far beyond the war years. Italian doctors and nurses trained in the American Penicillin program would go on to establish new protocols for pediatric infectious disease treatment throughout the country. The relationships formed between American and Italian medical personnel would lead to exchange programs and collaborative research in the post-war years. Seeds planted during the darkest days of war would bloom into medical cooperation that would last for generations. The program's impact became evident in Italian mortality statistics. In areas where the penicillin program operated for at least 3 months, infant and child mortality from infectious diseases dropped by more than 65% compared to pre-war levels. Children who would have died from pneumonia, meningitis, or sepsis were surviving at rates that seemed miraculous by the standards of the time. Dr. Angelo Ferrata, a pediatrician at the University of Florence who worked with American medical teams, later wrote, "What we witnessed was not merely the introduction of a new drug. It was a complete revolution in our understanding of what was possible in pediatric medicine. Conditions we had considered fatal became treatable. Children we would have mourned became survivors. The Americans brought not just penicillin, but a new paradigm for what medicine could achieve." As winter descended on Italy in late 1944, the penicillin program faced its greatest challenges. Supply lines stretched thin as the Allied advance slowed against fierce German resistance along the Gothic Line. Mountain villages became inaccessible as snow blocked roads. The heating and refrigeration needed to keep penicillin stable became harder to maintain in field conditions. Captain Williams responded with characteristic innovation. He established a network of distribution points in larger towns where penicillin could be stored properly, then organized local volunteers, often on skis or snowshoes, to carry doses to remote villages when children needed treatment. Italian doctors were taught to maximize the effectiveness of limited supplies by precisely timing doses and carefully selecting patients who would benefit most. The stories from this period take on an almost mythic quality in Italian cultural memory. Tales spread of American medicine arriving just in time, carried through snowstorms by determined medics. Children who had been given last rites by priests recovered within days after receiving the American miracle medicine. In village after village, American medical personnel were treated not as occupiers but as saviors. Father Domenico Palazzo, a parish priest in a mountain village near Modena, recorded in his journal, "Today I prepared to administer last rites to little Marco Bianchi, age 6, who has been near death with infection for 3 days. Before I could begin, his father burst in shouting that Americans had arrived in the next village with medicine. He carried the boy through snow a foot deep to reach them. This evening I visited expecting to pray over a small corpse. Instead, I found Marco sitting up, fever gone, asking for soup. His mother wept as she told me about the penicillin. If this is not a miracle from God working through American hands, I do not know what would be." The winter of 1944 to 1945 tested the program severely, but it also demonstrated the extraordinary commitment of the medical teams involved. Lieutenant David Cohen, who had treated Luca Conti nearly a year earlier, led a mobile unit into the mountains north of Bologna during one of the worst blizzards in recent memory. When their vehicle could go no further, Cohen and his team continued on foot, carrying penicillin and other supplies in their backpacks. They reached a village where diphtheria, a bacterial infection that could suffocate children as a membrane formed in their throats, had broken out. Without treatment, most of the affected children would die, and the disease would likely spread to neighboring communities. Cohen and his team worked for 72 hours straight, administering penicillin, teaching local caregivers how to continue treatment, and establishing quarantine procedures to prevent further spread. When they finally left, exhausted but successful, the villagers lined the single street, applauding as the Americans departed. Cohen later wrote to his wife, "In the midst of this terrible war, In a place where American soldiers would normally be feared, we were treated as if we were angels. I've never felt more certain that what we're doing matters, not just for winning the war, but for what comes after. By spring 1945, as Allied forces prepared for the final push that would end the war in Italy, the pediatric penicillin program had evolved into a systematic operation covering much of the country. American and Italian medical personnel worked side by side in a model of cooperation that transcended the traditional boundaries between military and civilian medicine, between occupiers and occupied. The program's success attracted attention from the highest levels of Allied leadership. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, after receiving reports on the initiative's impact, reportedly told his staff, "This is exactly the kind of effort that shows who we are as Americans. We're not just here to defeat an enemy, we're here to help rebuild what war has destroyed." In April 1945, as Allied forces broke through the last German defences in northern Italy, the penicillin program achieved what many considered its greatest triumph. In the Po Valley, retreating German forces had left behind a humanitarian crisis of staggering proportions. Refugees crowded into makeshift camps where infectious disease spread rapidly among malnourished children. Local medical facilities had been destroyed or stripped of equipment. The situation seemed hopeless. Captain Martinez led a task force of 20 American medical officers and 50 Italian healthcare workers trained in the penicillin program into the area. They established treatment centers in abandoned factories, schools, and in one case, a damaged church. Working around the clock, they identified children with the most serious infections and began treatment. The results defied every expectation. Within a week, they had treated over 600 children with life-threatening conditions. The survival rate exceeded 90%, in conditions where most of these children would have died without intervention. The operation demonstrated how far the program had come from its modest beginnings in Naples just over a year earlier. Lucia Bianchi, one of the Italian nurses who had been trained in the program and worked alongside Martinez in the Po Valley, later described the experience. "It was like watching the dead return to life. Children who were grey, breathless, burning with fever in the morning would be sitting up, talking, even smiling by evening. Parents who had been preparing to bury their children were instead watching them recover. I had never imagined medicine could work such wonders, especially in conditions like those: no clean water, little food, shelter that barely kept out the rain. But the Americans had taught us well, and the penicillin was truly miraculous." As the war in Italy came to an end in May 1945, the pediatric penicillin program faced a new challenge: transitioning from a military operation to a sustainable civilian medical system. Captain Williams and his team had anticipated this need and had been preparing for months. They had trained hundreds of Italian healthcare workers. They had established supply chains that could continue after American forces departed. They had created treatment protocols that could be maintained with limited resources. The transition was not without difficulties. Penicillin remained in short supply globally, and Italy's post-war economy was shattered. But the foundations had been laid for a transformation in Italian pediatric medicine. Italian doctors who had worked with the program took positions in hospitals and clinics across the country, bringing their knowledge of the new antibiotic with them. The final statistics of the program were staggering. Between February 1944 and May 1945, American medical teams and their Italian partners had treated more than 17,000 Italian children with penicillin. The overall survival rate was 89%, in conditions where many of these infections had previously been fatal. The program had trained over 500 Italian healthcare workers in penicillin administration and modern infection control. It had established treatment protocols that would continue to save lives long after American forces departed. But statistics alone cannot capture the program's true impact. That is better measured in the stories that Italian families would tell for generations. Stories of children at death's door who were saved by La Medicina Americana, the American medicine that seemed miraculous in its effectiveness. Rosa Esposito, who was 8 years old when American medics treated her for pneumonia in a field hospital near Rome, later became a pediatrician herself. 60 years after her treatment, she explained her career choice. "I never forgot watching those American doctors and nurses work. They saved my life with their penicillin, but they gave me more than that. They showed me what medicine could do, how it could snatch children back from death. I decided then, as I was recovering, that I would do the same for others when I grew up. Many of my generation made the same choice. We became doctors and nurses because we had seen American medicine perform what seemed like miracles." The pediatric penicillin program officially ended in September 1945 as American forces prepared to leave Italy. Captain Williams, who had led the initiative from its beginning, held a final ceremony at a children's hospital in Rome, where he formally transferred the remaining penicillin supplies and equipment to Italian authorities. In his remarks, translated for the Italian medical staff and parents who had gathered for the occasion, he said, "What began as a small humanitarian effort has become something none of us could have imagined. We came to Italy as soldiers in a terrible war. We will leave having helped build a bridge of medicine and compassion that I believe will last far longer than any of the destruction this war has caused. When these children grow up, perhaps they will remember not just that Americans came as an army, but that we used our medicine to heal, not just our weapons to fight." The legacy of the program extended far beyond Italy. The model it established, military medical resources extended to civilian populations, with an emphasis on transferring knowledge and capacity to local healthcare workers, would be replicated in future conflicts. In Korea, Vietnam, and later wars, American military medicine would include civilian assistance programs directly inspired by the Italian penicillin initiative. Dr. Michael DeBakey, who would become one of the world's most renowned heart surgeons, visited Italy in 1945 to study the program as part of his duties with the U.S. Surgeon General's office. His report concluded, "What has been accomplished here represents the finest tradition of American medicine. Beyond the immediate humanitarian benefit, this program has demonstrated that military medical assets can be leveraged to create goodwill that may prove more valuable than any traditional military victory. The children saved today will grow up remembering that Americans brought healing in the midst of war." For the medical personnel who had served in the program, the experience would define their careers and lives. Captain Sarah Martinez, who had watched the first dawn break over Naples in May 1944, was awarded the Legion of Merit for her role in establishing the program. After the war, she returned to the United States, completed medical school at Johns Hopkins University, and became a leading pediatric infectious disease specialist. In 1970, she returned to Italy as part of a medical exchange program and visited some of the communities where she had worked 25 years earlier. In Naples, she was hosted by a young doctor named Antonio Ricci, who, as a 7-year-old, had been one of her patients. In Rome, she was guest of honor at a reception attended by dozens of penicillin children, now adults with children of their own. In a small village near Florence, she found her name inscribed on a plaque in the town square, honoring the American angel who brought the miracle medicine. Captain James Williams returned to his pediatric practice in Boston, where he established one of the first dedicated pediatric infectious disease departments in the United States. The protocols he developed for penicillin use in resource-limited settings became a model for programs around the world. In 1962, he published a memoir titled The Penicillin Children, Medicine in Wartime Italy, which became a classic text in both medical and military history. Lieutenant David Cohen, whose treatment of Luca Conti had been one of the program's early successes, became a pioneering researcher in antibiotic development at the National Institutes of Health. The lessons he learned in Italy about adapting treatment to challenging conditions informed his work developing protocols for antibiotic use in developing countries. But perhaps the most profound legacy could be seen in Italy itself. In the decades following the war, Italy developed one of Europe's most advanced pediatric healthcare systems. Italian researchers made significant contributions to infectious disease treatment, building on the foundation established during those desperate wartime years. The generation of penicillin children grew up to include doctors, nurses, researchers, and healthcare administrators who would transform Italian medicine. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of the program's beginning, a conference was held in Naples, bringing together American and Italian medical personnel who had participated, along with many of the children, now in their 50 seconds and 60 seconds, who had been saved. Dr. Rosa Esposito, who had gone from patient to pediatrician, addressed the gathering. We often speak of the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe's infrastructure after the war. But there was another American initiative that rebuilt something more precious, the lives of children who would otherwise have been lost. Many of us in this room owe our very existence to American penicillin and the brave medical teams who brought it to us when we were at death's door. That medicine did more than save our lives. It changed how we thought about what was possible, what could be achieved even in the darkest circumstances. The story of American penicillin in wartime Italy is ultimately a story about how medicine transcended the boundaries of conflict, how healing created bonds between former enemies, how a breakthrough treatment reached those who needed it most despite the chaos of war. It demonstrates conclusively that even in history's darkest moments, compassion and innovation could create hope where none seemed possible. This does not diminish the horror of World War II, the millions of lives lost, the destruction that swept across continents. But it reminds us that even amid that devastation, there were moments of profound humanity, doctors and nurses working to save children regardless of nationality, parents weeping with gratitude as fever broke and breathing eased, communities remembering acts of healing as clearly as acts of violence. When military historians look back at World War II and analyze American impact in Italy, the conclusion extends beyond strategic victories and territorial gains. America built a bridge of medicine that emphasized saving lives as much as winning battles, that gave parents back children who would otherwise have been lost, that demonstrated principles that would reshape both military and civilian medicine for generations to come. The American military of 1944 to 1945 was not perfect, as propaganda sometimes claimed. It was simply operating on principles that opponents had not yet mastered, applied by medical personnel trained systematically and supported with unprecedented pharmaceutical production. Once those principles became common knowledge, once penicillin became widely available globally, the advantage disappeared completely. But the achievement remains historically remarkable and worthy of serious study. Through systematic training, coherent medical protocols, and a philosophy that trusted frontline medical personnel, America created a humanitarian initiative that could operate effectively even in the chaos of war. That achievement, studied and learned from by medical systems worldwide, stands as testimony to the enduring power of how medicine can transcend conflict, how healing can occur even in war's shadow, and how acts of compassion can echo across generations. The transformation of Italian children like Rosa Esposito, who witnessed American medical effectiveness firsthand and later became medical professionals themselves, represents the broader legacy of a program that did more than save lives. It inspired a generation to dedicate themselves to healing others. Her journey from desperately ill child in 1944 to respected pediatrician reflects the profound impact that a moment of compassion can have across a lifetime. The story of American penicillin in Italy is not a story of superiority or inherent advantage. It is a story of what happens when medical innovation meets humanitarian need, when military capability is directed toward healing rather than destruction, when enemies become partners in saving the most vulnerable lives caught in war's crossfire. In the villages and cities of Italy, where penicillin children grew up to tell their stories to their own children and grandchildren, the American military is remembered not just for liberation, but for a medicine that seemed miraculous, and the doctors and nurses who crossed battle lines to deliver it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.